Charleston, South Carolina, spring of 1850. In the grand bedroom of the Thornhill plantation house, something unspeakable was about to begin. Something that would cost three people everything they had, everything they were, and ultimately their lives. This is the story of Samuel, a man called the Giant who stood nearly 7 feet tall, of Master Richard Thornhill, a plantation owner obsessed with a twisted theory, and of Margaret Thornhill, a woman who became both victim and monster in a nightmare that lasted 4 years. What happened in that bedroom wasn't just immoral. It was a violation so profound that even in a society built on the brutality of slavery, it stood out as uniquely horrifying. And when the truth finally emerged, it destroyed everyone involved. Samuel was 28 years old in 1850. Born enslaved on a Virginia plantation, he'd been sold 3 times by the time Richard Thornhill purchased him at a Charleston slave auction for the staggering sum of $2,800. Why so much? Because Samuel wasn't just extraordinarily tall at nearly 7 feet. He was perfectly proportioned, powerfully built, and most importantly to Richard, he possessed what Richard called superior physical attributes that aligned with the pseudo-scientific racial theories spreading through the American South in the 1850s. Richard Thornhill was 43 years old, educated at Yale, and utterly consumed by the eugenic ideas emerging from Europe. He'd read everything he could find about heredity, breeding, and what he believed was scientific proof of racial hierarchies. But Richard had a problem that obsessed him more than any intellectual theory. After 12 years of marriage to Margaret, he had no children. And in a society where a man's worth was measured partly by his ability to produce heirs, Richard's childlessness was a source of deep shame. Margaret Thornhill was 35 years old, the daughter of another wealthy planter family, educated, cultured, and trapped in a marriage that had grown cold. Years ago, she'd suffered 3 miscarriages in the early years of their marriage. After the 3rd loss in 1845, Richard had stopped approaching her bed entirely. For 5 years, they'd lived as strangers in the same house, maintaining appearances in public while barely speaking in private. Margaret had accepted her childless fate. She'd made peace with it. She had no idea what Richard was planning. In February 1850, Richard called Margaret to his study and explained his theory. He'd been reading about breeding experiments, about how plantation owners were beginning to apply livestock breeding principles to enslaved people to create stronger workers. Richard had developed his own twisted variation of this idea. He believed that if Margaret couldn't conceive with him, perhaps the problem wasn't her body, but rather the compatibility of their union. And he'd decided to test this theory by introducing what he called a superior physical specimen into their marital bed. He was talking about Samuel. Margaret stared at her husband in horror. "You're suggesting I sleep with a slave? In our bed? With you present?" "Not suggesting," Richard responded coldly. "Informing you of what will happen. This is a scientific experiment, Margaret. We'll document everything. If you conceive, it will prove my theory about physical compatibility and superior breeding. The child will be raised as ours. No one need ever know the truth." Margaret's voice shook. "And if I refuse?" Richard's expression turned glacial. "Then I'll have our marriage annulled on grounds of your barrenness, and you'll return to your father's house in disgrace. At 35, childless and divorced, you'll spend the rest of your life as an object of pity and shame. Or you can cooperate with this experiment, bear a child, and maintain your position as mistress of Thornhill Plantation. The choice is yours." It wasn't a choice, not really. Just like Samuel would have no choice. Just like none of them truly had any agency in what was about to unfold. This is what slavery did. It created situations where everyone became trapped in cycles of violation and complicity. The first night was in March 1850. Richard had explained the arrangement to Samuel 2 days earlier. "You will perform your duty with Mrs. Thornhill 3 times per week until she conceives. You will follow my exact instructions. You will speak only when spoken to. If you refuse or fail to perform adequately, you will be sold to the turpentine camps where life expectancy is 18 months. Do you understand? Samuel understood. At nearly 7 feet tall and powerfully built, Samuel could have killed Richard Thornhill with his bare hands. But he'd survived 28 years of slavery by understanding that violence meant death, not just for him, but potentially for every enslaved person on the plantation. So he said the only thing a man with no real options could say. Yes, master. That first night, Margaret lay rigid in her bed, still wearing her nightgown, staring at the ceiling. Richard sat in a chair in the corner with a notebook and pen, observing like a scientist watching laboratory animals. Samuel stood by the door, his massive frame making the already small room feel claustrophobic, his expression carefully neutral. Proceed, Richard said coldly. What happened next wasn't love. It wasn't even sex in any meaningful human sense. It was rape. Margaret was being raped by the system that gave Richard complete legal control over her body. Samuel was being raped by the same system that made him legal property with no right to refuse. And Richard was the architect of both violations, destroying all three of them in his obsession with proving his twisted theories. The arrangement continued 3 times per week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, like clockwork. Each session the same nightmare of mechanical performance under Richard's cold observation, his pen scratching notes about positions, duration, Margaret's physical responses, Samuel's performance. Richard was documenting everything like a breeding manual for livestock. Sometimes Margaret cried silently throughout. Sometimes she stared at the ceiling and retreated so far into her own mind that she barely seemed present. Sometimes she looked at Samuel with an expression that was part apology, part shared horror at what they were both enduring. Samuel never spoke unless Richard asked him a direct question, never made eye contact with Margaret unless Richard specifically ordered it. He performed his assigned role with mechanical precision, a man who'd learned to disconnect his soul from his body to survive what was being demanded of him. By July 1850, 4 months into this nightmare, something unexpected happened. Margaret wasn't pregnant. Richard was growing frustrated. His careful documentation showed everything should be working. He began to vary the routine, consulting his books on animal husbandry, trying different positions, different timing, treating his wife and Samuel like breeding stock being optimized for productivity. But still, no pregnancy. In September 1850, 6 months in, Richard made a decision that revealed just how far his obsession had taken him. He decided he needed to observe more intimately to understand what was failing. So he didn't just sit in the corner anymore. He began to participate, not sexually, but he would position Margaret's body himself, would instruct Samuel in explicit detail about precisely what to do and how, would physically adjust them during the act like a breeder managing livestock coupling. Margaret had stopped crying by this point. She'd stopped feeling much of anything. She'd learned to dissociate completely, to send her mind somewhere else while her body remained in that bed being subjected to Richard's experiments. She barely spoke anymore, even during the day. She'd become a ghost in her own life. Samuel had also changed, the massive man who'd entered the Thornhill household with dignity and quiet. Strength had begun to break. He'd stopped eating properly, lost weight despite his size, developed a hollow look in his eyes. Other enslaved people on the plantation noticed and worried about him but knew better than to ask questions about where he disappeared to 3 nights a week. In November 1850, 8 months into the experiments, Margaret finally became pregnant. Richard was triumphant. His theory was proven, he declared. The problem had been his own physical incompatibility with Margaret, and introducing a superior physical specimen had solved it. He documented everything meticulously. He planned to write a paper about it for a scientific journal, though he'd need to obscure certain details. He even began to treat Margaret with something approaching kindness again, pleased that his experiment had succeeded. But Margaret felt nothing, no joy at finally being pregnant. No maternal excitement, just emptiness. because she knew the pregnancy was the result of rape. She knew the child growing inside her had been created through violation. She knew she'd carry this trauma for the rest of her life. And Samuel? Richard informed him that his services were no longer needed. Samuel would be reassigned to field work. Richard gave him a $20 bonus for his cooperation, as if money could somehow compensate for what had been done to him. Samuel took the money without expression and returned to the slave quarters. The child was born in August 1851, a boy Richard named Thomas. The baby was large, healthy, and had darker skin than could be explained by any story about Mediterranean ancestry or summer sun exposure. Plantation neighbors whispered. Richard's explanation about a complicated pregnancy causing unusual pigmentation convinced no one. But in 1851 South Carolina, nobody confronted a wealthy plantation owner directly about his family's secrets, no matter how obvious. Richard doted on Thomas. Finally, an heir. Proof of his theories. Evidence of his scientific genius. Margaret held her baby and felt complicated emotions she couldn't untangle. Love for the innocent child. Revulsion at how he'd been conceived. Grief for what could have been in different circumstances. And underneath it all, bone-deep trauma that never healed. But the story doesn't end with Thomas's birth, because Richard Thornhill had tasted success, and his obsession only grew deeper. In 1852, when Thomas was 1 year old, Richard decided he wanted another child. His experiment had worked once, so why not replicate the results? He informed Margaret that the arrangement with Samuel would resume. Margaret refused. For the first time in their marriage, she directly defied Richard. "No, never again. I gave you an heir. That was what you wanted. I will not go through that again." Richard's response was cold. "You will, or I'll ensure Thomas is raised by someone else while you're declared mentally unfit and institutionalized. Women's asylums are full of wives whose husbands found them inconvenient. Don't test me, Margaret." And Samuel? Richard summoned him with the same arrangement. 3 nights per week, same routine, same threat of sale to turpentine camps if he refused. The nightmare began again. But something was different this time. The first time, Margaret and Samuel had been strangers forced together. This time, they'd shared trauma. They'd both been destroyed by Richard's experiments. And in their shared horror, something human emerged. They began to talk during those awful sessions. Just quietly, when Richard stepped out briefly to retrieve something from his study, Samuel would whisper, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Margaret would whisper back, "It's not your fault. We're both victims of him." These tiny moments of human connection in the midst of violation weren't love. They weren't romance. They were two people recognizing each other's humanity and pain, finding the only comfort available in acknowledging their shared nightmare. By early 1853, Margaret was pregnant again. Another successful experiment for Richard. Another child conceived through violation. But this time, something had broken in Margaret completely. While pregnant, she began to speak openly to her sister during a visit about what Richard had been doing. Her sister was horrified, but also pragmatic. "Who would believe you? He's a respected man. You're talking about something so scandalous that even suggesting it would ruin you. If you speak publicly, you'll be called insane and institutionalized. You have to endure in silence." The second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, was born in October 1853. Again, too dark to be Richard's biological child. Again, neighbors whispered. Again, Richard maintained his elaborate explanations, but the whispers were getting louder. Other plantation owners began to avoid the Thornhills at social gatherings. Invitations dried up. The family was being slowly socially isolated, as the truth became an open secret nobody would speak aloud. Samuel, meanwhile, was dying inside. Working in the fields by day, summoned to the plantation house 3 nights a week while the experiments continued because Richard now wanted a third child to further prove his theories. Samuel had stopped eating almost entirely. He'd become gaunt despite his massive frame. In January 1854, Samuel made a decision. He'd endured 3.5 years of violations, fathered 2 children he'd never be allowed to acknowledge, been destroyed psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. He couldn't do it anymore. One night in the fields, Samuel simply walked away. He didn't plan, didn't prepare, just walked into the forest and didn't come back. Richard was furious. He posted a $300 reward for Samuel's capture and return, hired patrollers, sent tracking dogs. But Samuel had vanished. What Richard didn't know was that Samuel had only made it 40 miles north before collapsing from exhaustion and starvation. A Quaker family found him unconscious on their property, more dead than alive. They hid him, nursed him back to health, and eventually connected him with the Underground Railroad. Samuel made it to Pennsylvania by April 1854. He was free, but freedom didn't heal what had been done to him. Samuel lived in Philadelphia for 8 months after escaping. He found work at the docks, tried to build a new life, but he was haunted by nightmares, by memories, by the knowledge that 2 children in South Carolina carried his blood but would never know him, would be raised by the man who'd forced their conception. In December 1854, Samuel's body was found in his small room. He'd hanged himself. He was 32 years old. He left no note. But the Quaker family who'd helped him said Samuel had told them he couldn't live with what had been done to him, even though he knew he'd been a victim with no choice. Back in Charleston, Margaret had learned of Samuel's escape. She'd felt brief hope for him. Then, in early 1855, news filtered south through plantation networks that a giant runaway had been found dead in Philadelphia. Margaret knew. She didn't need confirmation. She knew. Something broke in Margaret then that never healed. She began to withdraw completely from life, barely spoke, rarely left her room, stopped caring for the children. Richard hired a nurse to handle Thomas and Elizabeth while Margaret slowly disappeared into catatonia. In March 1856, Margaret died. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but the enslaved women who'd cared for her in those final months whispered she'd simply stopped fighting to live, that she'd willed herself to death rather than continue existing with the trauma of what she'd endured. She was 41 years old. Richard was left alone with 2 children who grew up never knowing the truth of their conception. Thomas and Elizabeth Thornhill were raised to believe they were Richard's biological children, though the plantation whispers suggested otherwise. Richard himself lived until 1869, dying at 62. Without ever acknowledging what he'd done, his precious theories, his careful documentation, his scientific experiments, all of it amounted to nothing but 3 destroyed lives. Samuel, Margaret, and Richard himself, who'd isolated himself so completely through his actions that he spent his final years alone and shunned by society. The documentation Richard had kept so meticulously was discovered after his death by Thomas, then 18 years old. Reading his father's clinical notes about breeding experiments, about his mother's violations, about Samuel, Thomas burned every page in the fireplace. Then he sold the Thornhill plantation and moved to New York, cutting all ties with his South Carolina past. Elizabeth, age 16, was sent to live with relatives in Virginia who knew nothing of the family's history. Neither Thomas nor Elizabeth ever spoke about what they'd learned. They carried their parents' trauma into their own lives and eventually into early graves. Thomas died at 37 from alcoholism. Elizabeth at 35 from laudanum addiction. This is what slavery did. It created systems where people could be used as breeding stock, where human bodies became experiments, where wives could be legally coerced into participating in their own violation because they had no legal recourse, where enslaved people like Samuel had literally no ability to refuse commands, no matter how depraved. Richard Thornhill wasn't an anomaly. He was a product of a system that treated some humans as property and others as property managers. The brutality of his particular actions may have been unusual, but the structure enabling those actions was standard throughout the slaveholding South. Samuel deserved to live a full life, to have autonomy over his own body, to father children in love, not through coercion, to die old and surrounded by family, not alone at 32, so traumatized he couldn't continue living. Margaret deserved to be a wife, not a breeding experiment subject, to bear children conceived in love, not violation, to live free from trauma. Richard deserved to be stopped, to face consequences, to never be able to destroy two human beings in pursuit of his twisted theories. But slavery was a system where the powerless suffered, the complicit were trapped, and the powerful faced no accountability. And that's why it was evil, not just because of the dramatic cases like Samuel's, but because it was built on the premise that some people could own others, and that premise inevitably led to horrors. Today, there are likely descendants of Thomas and Elizabeth Thornhill living throughout America, carrying Samuel's DNA without knowing his name or his story, carrying Margaret's trauma without understanding why their family history feels so heavy. This story didn't end in 1856. It echoes through generations, in the trauma passed down, in the secrets kept, in the truth finally told. Samuel, Margaret, and even Richard, in his own self-inflicted way, all paid terrible prices. But Samuel and Margaret were victims. Richard was the monster the system allowed to exist. And we remember their story not to sensationalize horror, but to understand what slavery actually meant in the intimate spaces where its brutality destroyed human souls.